much of an issue. The motion before the House is that this House would ban the use of advanced analytics in political campaigns. Without further ado, Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Okay. The integration of AI and machine learning into many of the world's leading industries has seen highly problematic issues arise. I would say this is going to be far worse for politics, where misleading information and nefarious incentives will likely lead to the deprivation of choice, of variance, and actual political consent. I'm going to do two things in my speech, right? The first thing I want to do is talk about what we think the goals of political campaigns are. And secondly, why it is that elections address these problems right now, but these problems will these processes are likely to be perverted by these machine learning systems. Before that, though, I just want to characterize what we think advanced analytics looks like, right? I think there's two broad features that are important to point out from opening government. The first is to point out that advanced analytics allows a much better understanding of voters' pre-election preferences and about the weighting between those preferences, right? We have polls to know how people feel about XYZ, but we don't know whether the same person our model is then going to be very simple. We're going to ban it. We're going to ban it everywhere. If there's a gray area, we'll also ban it. Any POIs about hypothetical middle grounds, I'll ban it as well. So firstly, then, what do we think the goals of the political campaigns generally look like? I think there's two things, right? The first thing that we think political commands look like is that we'll probably agree with Op that democracy should fulfill preferences, and the end outcome is that we want to serve people. But the second function political campaigns have is that elections are both preference fulfilling and preference creating. A crucial function of elections is to help people figure out what they want and to better understand the trade-offs between issues and how various decisions will impact them and the people around them, contingent on the issues of others, right? Just note a simple intuition, which is that the reason why all democracies are representative as opposed to direct is because people lack all information they need at the outset to create a reasonable government. For example, some people assign far more value to issues than others. Some people just don't understand some issues. And some people would change their minds if it was clear of the effect some issues had on other people. In light of this, a one-person, one-vote system does not necessarily maximize beneficial outcomes without having a mechanism to address these irregularities. So how do elections address these problems right now, and why then does this pervert that process, right? I want to talk about three mechanisms here. The first mechanism I want to talk about is in most elections have a multi-level structure in which there is a phase where people get to test ideas, and then a later phase where winning ideas get used to win the election. Think primary systems or voting for a set of local candidates by following a national list. What this allows for is the competing versions of ideal messages, and even the same message to be fleshed out on a macro scale. People test these ideas in a campaign and end up in disagreements and debates. These discussions are valuable because they allow people to understand the trade-offs between issues that are counterintuitive, not just in terms of which message they like most, but also in-depth analysis on what is politically possible, what other voters want, and how they should balance their concerns, etc. Right? This plays a crucial role in helping voters reshape their ideas, and as they want changes, candidates can respond in real time by updating their positions to account for negotiated compromises from the primary based on real-time input to changing poll data, etc. Lastly, advanced analytics makes this impossible because what it does is it identifies people's initial views at the onset and tries to maximize what increases their desire to vote for you immediately. Note the potential for this to go wrong right now, right? This looks like micro-targeting people who may have extreme views in one dimension and activating them with the most incendiary message possible in a way that turns them off from other candidates before the fact and makes it impossible for this process of persuasion or discussion to happen in the first place. Moreover, it looks like giving people information that incentivizes them to lock in their existing positions before there has been any negotiation. Now, before I move on to the second mechanism, I'd be happy to take a POI from closing.
So will parties still be able to use this data outside of political campaigning?
No.
Or do you completely ban it?
Yeah, we're going to completely ban it. In any way that politicians can use this advanced analytics to alter their decision making, we don't want it. So, second mechanism as to how we address these problems, right? But before that, I just want to quickly address one thing, which is I think a lot of arguments in this debate are likely going to focus on why it is that this allows you to make better policy that is exactly what the people are looking for, right? Some type of like oblivious simplification of how this process is actually going to look. I just have a couple preemptive responses and layering to explain why this argument is so significant, right? I think the first thing to point out here is that in many cases, they are not going to get their best case scenario, which is that problematic policy that reinforces inflammatory rhetoric in conservative localities is probably equally as likely as them getting good policy in areas that have very homogenous beliefs, which is also probably unlikely considering I would imagine that most places have pretty divergent beliefs, especially where it is politically inflammatory or politically important to win those areas, right? But the second thing to point out is even in cases where this creates more tailored policy, it omits part of how politics is about discourse and preference creation, which is now entirely reliant on this technology. Thirdly, this also lowers the variance overall in politics, right? So the comparative here then becomes that in the status quo, there are processes in which politicians need to use an aggregated platform to react to shifting popularity of different policies to create reasoning and justifications around the things that they support. An alternative in which every politician already knows what they think is the best, or an alternative in which only the richest candidate knows what is actually best, is a draconian future in which there's less choice in the political system overall. But next, I want to talk secondly, why advanced analytics creates an incredibly strong competitive advantage for candidates who use it in the initial instance. Since campaigns have a very high incumbency and early polling advantage, everyone will rapidly converge to this system, right? The first thing to point out is that this makes politics have much lower variance, which is that far fewer people like Bernie who enter the election with a set of issues that nobody is committed to beforehand. This then means that most candidates end up looking quite similar. Crucially, even if this fulfills preferences well, the processes of new candidates of a high variance is good because it provides an educational function that expands on what issues people are thinking about. This shifts the Overton window and brings in information that the algorithm can never access beforehand because it hadn't existed before. Overall, for the formation of better preferences and the selection of better preferences, I am so very proud to propose.
Great. Leader of UP, you have the floor.
I'm audible, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. First, why this will be regulated and done in a good way. Secondly, why it will lead to more accessibility in political campaigns, which evens out the field and crowds out privileges and the fact that many politicians have a shit ton of money. And thirdly, onto maximizing preference. Let's begin firstly with regulation, which directly clashes with the vast majority of the case coming from OG. A few reasons as to why this will be regulated in a maximally efficient way. The first thing that just want to generally point out is that the state has a massive incentive to regulate this well, because otherwise it would undermine the fundamental principles of UNWE, which stands for. That is to say, democracy, rule of law, maximizing the freedom and preferences of people. Secondly, political parties have a maximally selfish incentive to do so, considering that if another political party actively uses this more efficiently or abuses it, this actively undermines their chances to be re-elected, which means that they're going to be strict regulations. Thirdly, in terms of civil society, many people care a lot about their privacy. That is to say, how their data specifically is used, and they don't want to be manipulated because people intrinsically care about freedom. Or some nations, for example, the UK or the USA or like the US, have a culture that is engraved on maximizing their preferences and generally caring about freedom. Fourthly, generally speaking, there is a scientific community, like, for example, that is developing those technologies that are, generally speaking, very ethical, care about developing humanity in a very good way. Generally speaking, are going to, again, lobby the government in a way that ensures this will be regulated in an effective way. I think the bottom line of this is pretty intuitive. In the vast majority of cases, political parties, the scientific community, and generally speaking, people care about fair elections because this is something very personal to them, because it allows them to maximize their preferences. It allows them to live a prosperous life. But generally speaking, they also have selfless incentive to do so, which means this will be done in a way that allows us to effectively select out the data that's actively being used. Most likely there will be independent committees that are actively checking whether or not this will be used in a proper way. Or thirdly, there is going to be strict regulations on private entities that are actively developing developing those algorithms. Secondly, onto accessibility. The problem in the status quo is pretty intuitive. You're a politician who either by virtue of privilege have a lot of money, or secondly, you are a massive political party that by virtue of existing for so long, as compared to small political parties, have a lot of money and a lot of donors and specific nepotistic connections that you can actively use. This is crucial because your capacity to specifically target people, to make sociological like polls, to specifically make huge campaign events, to have a shit ton of volunteers, to actively have a lot of advertisements, and generally speaking, to reach out to people is strictly tied to money prior to the existence of this policy, which means candidates that don't have those connections, and specifically the connections that give them money, are gated away from the opportunity to have the same accessibility in terms of political campaigning. Why will this policy be very accessible, or it's on a trajectory over the long term to become very accessible? The first thing that I just generally want to point out, there is state funding for many policies or many technologies that are considered essential for a party or for a candidate to succeed. This is why intuitively political parties receive funding for campaigning, which actively means that the state and political parties have an incentive to lobby to receive adequate access either to an algorithm that is state-based, or secondly to finance it in order to have this algorithm. Secondly, in terms of the private sector, there is a massive amount of competition between companies that have basically racing themselves to the bottom to make it as accessible as possible to private agents and to political parties, considering there is a massive amount of lucrative profits if they manage to do so. And secondly, they want to increase their market share, which means over the short term, they're willing to undercut their profits in order to actively ensure that they get contracts over the long term with political parties. This actively means that this lucrative market over the long term leads to more accessibility. Thirdly, the AI and specifically the analytics community isn't just about profits. There are massive amounts of people that are very enthusiastic, passionate, and care about values like democracy and freedom, which are developing those technologies and are making it accessible. They're basically making them open source, which actively means that it is accessible regardless of the selfish incentives of many actors. Why is this important? Firstly, I think it is important because now it evens out the political field, because now politicians can maximize their scarce resources, especially if they're disprivileged and don't have the same capacity like big parties to actively ensure that their campaigns, and specifically that the way they're targeting people are firstly more efficient in targeting people, which maximize resources, but second, at the point at which they're more efficient in meeting their targets of actively engaging people. This actively means they can reach out to more groups instead of specifically targeting and being risk averse and specifically targeting previous demographics. Now, before I talk about maximizing preference, I'll take a point from CJ.
You've proven that there is access to data, but you haven't proven why people in positions of power with more capital will not be better able to use that data to weaponize it for themselves.
Okay, but still, if this is accessible and like the info slide basically says that the algorithms are going to be semi-autonomous, which means you require 2 or 3 experts, or in the best cases over the long term, secondly, this becomes fully autonomous and it can do this on its own. This means that the capital you require for you to hire experts and to have expertise is very minimal, which means that again, it is very accessible to people. Now, on to maximizing preferences. How does this maximize preferences, as OG kind of already concedes that this is able to do so? Firstly, it gives us a closer understanding of the beliefs of people. Secondly, it allows us to have more persuasive messages that specifically target demographics, preferences, and the personalities of certain people. Thirdly, the analytics give us the capacity to see changing demographics and also to see correlations not only between a specific demographic caring about certain values and policies, but also why a certain person who cares about certain policies may also care about other proximate policies, which actively means it allows us the ability to maximize the efficiency of targeted advertisements. Why is this hugely important? Firstly, politicians in the vast majority of cases exist in bubbles, or even if they are disprivileged over the long term, they start to exist in bubbles. That is to say, demographics are constantly changing, but they don't have access to the way in which they are not actively living with normal people. They live in their own social privileged bubbles, which means they get out of touch or have different privileged beliefs that are out of touch with the preferences of people. Secondly, this is uniquely powerful in actively engaging people. That is to say, persuasive messages are the precondition for you to actively get interested again in politics, to feel as though somebody wishes to represent you, which gives you an incentive to get more informed. But secondly, This allows us the capacity to target multiple groups at once, while in the status quo prior to this technology, certain political parties would only cater to their own demographics and would entrench in those beliefs. Now, at the point at which you can do this more efficiently and you can maximize your resources better, this actively means that you can cater to different groups, which means you reduce the amount of echo chambers. And finally, the alternative is much worse. If politicians don't know what's happening, they rely on populism. That is to say, us versus them rhetorics. That is to say, actively critiquing the character of people or boasting their own personal qualities and sending vague messages, instead of actively relying on concrete policies for which over the long term you can hold them accountable if they get re-elected. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
Great. DPM, the floor is yours.
Okay, just give me 1 second. Hold on, let me catch a time. All right, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Going to start time. 3, 2, 1. The first thing I want to explain in the DPM speech is why the construction problem is the most important problem that democracies have to solve. What we explained to you is that democracies should not just be about preference fulfillment, because if they were to be about preference fulfillment, in theory, we could have a direct democracy, or at least we could have AI administer a direct democracy, and we would end up getting the best outcomes. But we've learned that this is not the case, that in general, brute majorities don't make good decisions because there are certain structural issues with democracy that render that impossible, that we can't get every single thing that we want because there are anti-democratic features built into our system that force us to have compromises, that sometimes even if 51% of people want things, 49% of people have a much stronger preference for that thing, and that's a legitimate reason for us to want that outcome in democracy. And finally, people often have a limited understanding of issues that don't directly affect them, or about the trade-offs between issues and the way in which they indirectly affect one another. And these kinds of relationships, when become aware of them, can change what you vote for and what kind of policies you end up wanting. So a crucial problem we have to solve on opening government is to help people construct their preferences in a way that is better. And note the practical outcomes of this, right? We think that there are two broad things. The first one is, this is virtually the only way to solve policies passing in the polarized environment that we live in that given that people are digging in their heels increasingly, given that in basically every democracy on earth, political polarization is trending up and not down, it's important for politicians to negotiate compromises as early as possible, because if they don't, and if they commit themselves to the position that their core base wants, it's incredibly hard for them to then turn on what they committed themselves to and dug in their heels on and say, we're going to work with the other side. So it's only in the instance in which you make those compromises early on before you're elected and you convince people of their utility that you're able to pass policy, versus a world in which basically the policy process stagnates. I want to note that a corollary of this is that the less policy gets passed as a result of this polarization, the worse that polarization gets, because people become increasingly convinced that it's impossible to work with the other side, and that doing nothing or not working with the other side is only going to result in things deteriorating more. Hence, it's better to remove the other side from the conversation. So when they talk about things like political populism being used to exclude certain groups in the process altogether, that is a consequence directly of a narrative that says that we can't work with the other side, that compromise is just not possible. Second general implication of this, though, is that we need to bring more ideas into the system, and that crucially requires us to bring in ideas that we were not previously aware of. So one thing I'm going to note here is that AI just does not have the capacity to know our preferences before they exist, right? It can test against available data, but it cannot generate an out-of-sample fit for something that is not in sample. And that is critical, because what we say is having an imperfect politics, one that has a high degree of variance, in which people can say new things that have not been tested at a very high risk to themselves, is the only way to bring in ideas that represent groups or ideologies that previously were disadvantaged for systematic reasons. So if you're coming in representing felons, and felons have not been a huge part of the political discourse, then there's a higher chance that people start to care about that, and that if you can bring other people on that side, then you can start to bring about change on those people's behalf, if not in a major way, then at least in a minor way, in terms of getting political compromises that can favor those groups. That is something that is essentially impossible and ruled out on their side of the house. Let's deal with OO's case. There's three general ideas here. The first one they give is there's going to be regulation. Most of these warrants are very and ripped from Matter Prep. They say people care about rule of law and parties want to make sure that other parties don't abuse this. This is not true in the environment we live in now, because first of all, politicians and parties are operating in a highly polarized, highly populist environment. And so there is no short-term incentive for you to try to give up all of your power and essentially say that in the long term, this will save democracy. If you can maximize your odds of winning right now, and if your base believes that the other side winning is tantamount to murder, is tantamount to you letting tons and tons of issues that you care about never pass again, then it's very, very likely that politicians opt for that short-term incentive. It's very, very hard to opt out. And even if you think it would be better that you did opt out, if you believe that there's even a 5% chance that the other side is cheating on their end of the bargain, then you're incentivized to opt in as well, just to maximize the chance that they don't corrupt and capture the political system while you unilaterally disarm. That also then deals with the idea that some people care, or that some people value privacy, or that the scientific community matters, right? Because ultimately, the only two actors that matter here are A, the people who create the technology, for which I would say large technology companies that produce tech have much more of an incentive in selling technology than they do in heavily watering down that technology, which is why, for example, there's about 100 times more people developing AI algorithms than there are working on AI ethics. And secondly, if politicians and political parties want to use it, then they're going to have willing sellers. On top of that, I just think we're very pessimistic about the prospect for regulating these things. I mean, the entire point of an AI model is that it's a black box, is that you don't understand how it gets from point A to point B. So at the point in which you're getting to point B, going backwards and saying we didn't like how it got there is going to be near impossible. Next thing they say is that this is going to undermine privileges in politics. The first thing I want to note is that if we think that this technology is bad when lots of people use it, we're happy to concede that everybody gets the technology and it makes politics worse. That is enough to beat the argument. But on top of that, I'd say two things. Firstly, I think that we're trending in a way that makes this less of a problem. Things like free media and social media are making politics more accessible. The correlation between having money and winning elections has severely broken down in most of the countries that we're talking about as a consequence of this. But secondly, and more importantly, even if your algorithms allow you to get an even playing field, then the only other way you can differentiate yourself, right, is taking the insights of those algorithms and just reaching as many people as possible, which still, according to them, requires a huge amount of resources. So it's not clear that this resolves any disparities, just changes on the intensive margin what strategies people with and without money use. The final thing they say is that you're going to be able to see things that you could not see before. And before I deal with that argument, I'll give CEO a chance to engage.
Campaigns usually have platforms they run on regardless of using this kind of tech. When potential governments start coalition building, compromise has to happen regardless of the campaigning that happened during the election process.
You're right that compromise has to happen eventually, but our claim is that it's much harder if you commit yourself to a different set of views in the election, and we're seeing this empirically where governments are breaking down because they can't get things done. In terms of positions that they would campaign on otherwise, yes, we agree there's some degree of static in politics, but we made two specific claims. The first thing we told you is that in the process of those static ideas being debated, trade-offs that you were not initially aware of become revealed, and when you become aware of those trade-offs and the interaction effects between things, your preferences change through time, and the best politicians respond to that, which is how they win the first stage of the election and get to the second stage. The second thing we told you is that when there's a higher degree of variance, when nobody has the really strong competitive incentive to have the exactly right message in the very first sentence, because if they don't, they automatically lose. That means that people like Bernie Sanders can come into elections and can change what people are talking about, can challenge the existing norm at a high risk to themselves, but that high risk, high reward strategy can often completely change what we're talking about in politics 10 years later and create new issues that nobody knew about prior. This then is what beats the opening opposition final argument, right? Which is just that they say that you might be able to expand people's view of ideas because the AI is picking up on it and you're not. But if you're using micro-targeting, then you're not making everyone aware of these issues, right? You're making specific people aware of these issues. What we explain to you is that everyone has to be aware of these new ideas and the trade-offs between these new ideas, because only that is the way that people can actually learn about how they relate to others in the political process and actually make the compromises that are necessary to keep democracy afloat for a long period of time. We're very proud to propose.
Great. DLO, the floor is yours.
Hi, I presume it can be heard.
Yeah, you're audible.
Great. POIs in chat, I would say confirm closing at 5, and I'll begin in just a second. So, starting in 3, 2, 1. The interesting thing is that OG already considered our case. They said in PM, this becomes lower barriers for politicians to enter, which is bad in their own analysis. But I think to the point at which they already considered this, it's very easy for us to take this win. But let's engage with their case. Firstly, what do they say? You will be able to change some people's opinions in a worse way. Here's the thing. I want to prove to you why the alternative likely is very much either good for big parties already or just worse for smaller politicians. Why is this the case? Firstly, note that while this is banned, it means that you will go to other worse alternatives for you to reach this data. This looks like you buying data from social media companies and actively looking at who interacts in what way. And maybe it is not as advanced as the AGI, but it's very similar, right? Because, for example, if you get the data from Facebook, you can see what people like, and this subconsciously shows you how much or in what way they interact with the political views in the sphere, which means that this, however, is only accessible to the big parties because it's one, very expensive, but two, you need to have the connections in order to be able to do so. Smaller candidates and parties don't have access to this. But secondly, even if you buy that, oh, maybe this is regulated, even though I don't think in the status quo it is, I think there's another thing which shows why big parties have access to do this anyways, which is they have the money, the capital, and the connections to hire very good researchers who can give them similar data that the AGI can, right? Who are very geniuses in their fields and basically can see how people interact with what. I think to the point to which you can do this, the problem is just that those people who have the information anyways, the delta here is whether smaller parties have this is just if everybody has access to this and basically makes it more equal. But last thing, you have other ways to specifically target individuals in a way that is not with this algorithm, right? This looks like, for example, doing rallies in specific regions that are, for example, red states, and you know that the moment that you do this and you go on specific issues that you already know that they're doing because of the polls your researchers do because you pay them good money, you can target them and still be able to radicalize them to that extent. So what's the point here? You can also buy very big billboards in specific areas and still convince them. You can probably control the medias because most parties are affiliated with different media, such as Fox being controlled by the Republicans and stuff like this, which means there's a huge advantage for political parties currently to stay in power. And please note that this is not a US-centric debate. Most countries have more than two parties in parliament, which means smaller parties are very important to get into power. And if we prove that big parties have a big advantage now, evening out the playing field is very important. But I'm going to weigh this in a second. Why is it firstly likely that you will help smaller parties? A few things. One, it's not only that you can see their preference, but rather that you can do the targeted ads for specific regions and peoples in a more accessible way. Because currently for you to buy a billboard, it costs like $1 million. To do a rally, even more, which means that those people don't have this kind of money and basically do not do this and just go to different areas that is just cheapest for them to do so, which often is not as many people as they can reach and also most often not what people necessarily want. So why would this help? First, you are able to reach the people that potentially could be swing voters, right? That's the most important thing, because people who are already radical have no choice. They will probably vote for the radical party at all cases. And the liberals, same thing. But rather, it's about the people you can't access, the swing voters. For example, Republicans that is kind of hesitant and doesn't know if they want to vote for Democrats. Now, for example, Democrats can target those people and not put them in echo chambers where they're only surrounded by Republican ads right now because they're the ones that go to that region. Secondly, you, for example, don't have to go to every city because it's inaccessible for you to do so. You don't have to do those big rallies all the time. Now you have this alternative way. But secondly, why is it so important for those people to get into power? Firstly, they're the ones that most often bring the innovation. OG claim, but once you have this information, all people want to win, and basically you will not bring new ideas. 3 rebuttals as to why this is unlikely to be the case. One, not that many people get into politics because they want to bring innovation and something new. Why? Because being a politician sucks. It takes a lot of time. It's low paid unless you get to a very high position. And it's generally you have to sacrifice things like your privacy, which means that people get into politics, like the newer ones and the newer parties and more progressive people, get with the incentive to bring something new, not necessarily win at all costs, which means that the moment you give this mechanism to them, they're better able to maximize it and actively bring the goods that they can, right? Such as, for example, bringing new policies and improving discourse within parliaments and not having just old guys argue about random stuff that young people don't care about. Or, for example, more progressive things because they're likely more progressive in that regard. But secondly, they're the ones that hold the governments accountable. They're the ones that actively want to expose corruption and break the status quo. And they're also the ones that are likely to do this in a more passionate way. Why is this very important. One, most often than not, those parties represent people that were never represented before, which is more important than maybe radicalizing a few people that are already radical, right? Because if you get representation from people that were not represented before, you're better likely to improve their quality of life and actively make them less vulnerable in that regard. But secondly, it just impacts more people. Yes, their impact might exist for some people who shift their opinion, but that is unlikely because many people who are already extreme in that regard will do this, or even if they have the initial initial ideas on this that they might get radical, they will likely get swayed by other mechanisms that big political parties have. The idea is for us to counter this and actively be able to expose them to different views and might maybe increase the chance of those smaller parties winning. Even if we get their votes to get up by like 10%, this is extremely important because it gives them more money from parliaments that they get from the budget. But before I continue, CG. OG.
Isn't it also true that if these small parties have particular weaknesses because of the limited capital, you having access to specific data that can challenge them and mitigate them also empowers you?
But again, this is the thing, you probably already have this. I'm unsure why this specifically gives you this advantage. But even if I presume that you do, the benefit outweighs it. You don't necessarily get a lot of data, what is their weakness, because this is not as personalized. The idea is for you to understand how to get those politicians, those people to reach them, such as with targeted ads, or just generally want to know what they necessarily want, and you're not going to be populist and just representing the high elite that are educated, but rather being able to reach the vulnerable people who are not as educated in an understandable manner, because you don't know how to do this as a new politician, as a smaller party. Now, let's continue with this. There are a few other things to rebut. Secondly, I already rebutted no ideas sir brought. I think this is absurd. I already rebutted why you will be able to shift opinions. I think what the best thing they have to do here is about regulation. They say this will not be regulated as well. I think this is not the case, because if you have competing parties, they have the incentive to not give advantage to either one of them. So this is regulated, and also there's likely to be committees that look this in an independent point. What's the most important here to notice is that this is likely to become very accessible with time because companies compete, even if it's not currently. But secondly, even if we are able to maximize preference and represent more people, this is not only morally correct, but practically good for people and improve their lives, as well as allowing smaller politicians to come to power, improve the political system, and hold them accountable. Vote us.
Great. Member of Gov, you have the floor.
Hi, can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two broad areas of engagement to OO before moving on to our extensions and why that wins over OG. The first thing they argue for is this technology is likely to be regulated very well. 4 sets of responses. First, the very nature of this technology means it is autonomous, or at worst semi-autonomous, which means the machine operates in a way in which is beyond human capacities to think. So at the point in time where these kinds of regulations happen, they happen post facto on action already being done, i.e. the message being amplified or it already happening. A lot of this technology is hard to control from humans to begin with. That's the nature of the technology. 2, let's assume that there are political incentives of certain courts to hold these companies accountable. This is only true where that politics has evolved to the point it is a developed country. But this debate happens globally, i.e. companies like Twitter and Facebook operate in countries like Bangladesh and India as well, where criminal justice systems are significantly weaker when it comes to this. So if you have a sensational message that even borders lines on hate speech, it is extremely unlikely a politicized court such as that of India or Bangladesh will hold this accountable, or it is unclear why people or voters in America care about the messages that are being spread in India or Bangladesh. That's why you have hate speech on Twitter and WhatsApp that leads to things like Muslims being killed by Hindus in India. Third, I think it's also important to recognize that within the veil of ignorance, there are other principles that these companies can hide behind as well. Things like data privacy, things like freedom of speech. So they say this algorithm operates independently and amplifies it to you, and they don't intervene in that because that hurts another one of these Western liberal values that you really care about, like the fact that you are now as a company having to see what this person is searching, or violating their privacy, or violating their freedom of speech. Ultimately meaning there are many ways in which you can scapegoat this regulation in order to make sensational news that makes you give money. So the conclusion, or that gives you money, conclusion is this regulation is extremely unlikely. The second thing they argue is this technology is inherently more accessible to smaller parties. If you look through your notes, they've only proven there are mechanisms, not necessarily incentives, that make this data accessible. First, it is unclear why the accessibility is to a greater degree on smaller parties. Yes, smaller parties have access to that data, but so do large parties at the same time. The problem is once that data is accessed, large parties have lots of tools through which they can better use that data, if anything, to control the rise of small parties. The first thing is they can highlight small indices or small increases in numbers very early on, because that spike in a graph is something that they catch early on because they have access to data. Number two, they also know the minor preferences of those individualized voters that are slowly going away to a minority party. So they can use short-term incentives or low-cost things that spins the story against them. Like find out what this one politician did in high school and spin that story as something that this person is untrustworthy too. The third thing is, like, even if you don't buy that this empowers those with money to buy better computers and better technicians to disempower smaller parties from rising. At best, there is a mitigation. In our world, we still have social media marketing as well, which bases the existence or the structure of social media marketing costs the same amount of money, which means maybe you market with slightly less preferences, but your access to social media marketing still exists regardless. The preference accumulation thing is therefore a wash on both sides. The only other thing they say is you get access to the worst kinds of data. This bites their own argument of regulation. Like, then regulate these bloody companies and don't give them access to data for the big companies to begin with. Or out of this debate. The first extension I'll talk about is why this makes politicization far more bipolar. I think where OG ends their analysis is that it is much easier for people with different views to come in later on in politics or the conversation to evolve over a period of time. But they don't explain the really structured mechanism and the incentives of political parties to really turn political cycles vitriolic. The first thing I'd like to argue is the biggest priority for any political party, regardless of what their intentions are in the long run, is to win the next election in the short run. This is what gives them power to exercise control and makes them have an identity, control where they want their legislation to look like, how they want to shape their policy, put their own people at different points of power. Power, getting access to power, is the fundamental conduit to everything else. How do you get access to power, and why is that better when you have access to data? Number one, you have passionate voters, i.e. you can find who is more likely to show up to vote, and therefore you can spin the narrative and find those people and get them to vote to begin with. Number two, in a world where new people want to come in, you understand the minor margins through which you can differentiate really early on. And number three, in a world where things like political capture of companies is strongly demonized, you have greater ROI with smaller amounts of money, so you need less political lobbying, and therefore you can use that to sensationalize and capture small voters using less amounts of money. Why is this really bad? This short-termist incentive enables a mechanism through which you get power in the shortest time possible with the least amount of money spent. That is often by being vitriolic to the vast majority of people and enabling them to form hate speeches or be hateful to a particular group by basis of insecurity. 4 reasons or 4 mechanisms why this is done. First, the data you use is often historical data, which is often stacked in a way in which makes particular groups feel like they are worse than they actually are. So a vast majority of white people are probably not racist, but they've searched something on Google about anti-immigration once at a point in time. The comparative is that bias is often hidden or forgotten or never triggered. But in the world where you know the individualized preferences of everyone, you can trigger it. So you confirm that bias that otherwise would be completely forgotten. Number two, this is empowered through social media algorithms that amplify that to more people with same preferences. CEO, very quickly.
Do you think Modi would suddenly become super pro-Muslim and not at all racist just because they couldn't micro-target on Facebook?
But no, that's not the argument. The argument is Modi gets worse, yet his ability to do all of these things is worsened when he has access to this data. It doesn't have to be like we change the world for good. We just stop it from becoming worse. That's a competitive that we win as well. So the second mechanism is algorithmic feeding. Once you win that, you feed it to people with similar preferences as well. The third is sensational content by nature has more clicks and engagement. So social media companies have an incentive to amplify that as well. Lastly, because you have access to micro-level individualized data, you can balance out and create selection bias. You know what the limited attention span of particular individuals operate through. So you know which issues they really click through or read through, or you know which issues they selectively ignore. So you create messages that make sure that their attention is only basis that one message, and the selection bias that you trigger means they're less likely to search for other news articles or read more. That's how, because you have access to this data, you can create that echo chamber that prevents the worst or creates the worst excesses of politicization and bipartisanship. What I've done is successfully proven the incentives of politicians to do this and the structured mechanisms through which politicians, data, and social media companies do this. OG did not do any of this legwork to prove the impact that they're basing their case on. Very clear to win this debate basis those.
Great. Member of UP, the floor is yours.
Hello, let me just reorder my stuff. Order the papers. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in, maybe fast, in 3, 2, 1. When you take away the set of information which people basically need to meaningfully consent at the ballot box, this is fundamentally unjust, and this is going to be our main claim. Let's quickly talk about all of other 3 teams in this debate. Let's talk about CG, team which has very, very small comparative, if any. Their biggest claim is that this gives you incentive as a politician to amplify differences and polarize people and voters. Panel, I just want you to check your guts. Facebook and Twitter echo chambers already exist. Mean algorithms which push and incentivize people to be inflammatory already exist. You as a politician always have an incentive to push the most passionate voters at the ballot box. Often they are very extreme. Nations all around the world are incredibly polarized. The US, the UK, all of us are very, very polarized. And I do not believe that any meaningful impact on polarization exists on CG. And even if it exists, it is so marginal that I do not think it should matter more than any other set of considerations in this debate. Let's talk about opening government, team which basically lacks any real and exclusive harm. The closest they get to a harm is this is maximizing your desire to vote for specific politicians. First of all, why is this bad? If I presumably see an ad for a party and I'm like, yeah, I like this party now, this presumably means that this messaging corresponds to what I believe and hold as something which is very important, right? I don't see why this is an inherent harm. Secondly, why is this an exclusive harm? Whenever I walk throughout the street or I see an ad on the TV, right, or I see a billboard, right, this presumably sometimes it raises my desire to vote for a specific party, right? So even if maybe this is a harm, it is a very non-inclusive, right? And I do not believe they can claim it, right? Third question on this is, why the alternative is me actually weighing properly, like multiple different considerations, like besides my like particular interest, right? I do not believe they explain any of this, right? I do believe that the other sort of harms which they have is that this kind of lowers variances in politics, right? This makes no sense, right? On our side of the house, we're basically defending micro-targeting, right? When parties can micro-target, they have an incentive to basically portray their programs to be more particular and more specific. This is what OO says as well, right? So I do not believe that on the side that basically defends majoritarian views and broad messaging, they can claim that this kind of pushes like politics to be the same. Finally, let's quickly basically chat about opening a position, team which relies on a set of very beneficial conditions which might not occur always, right? So notice a bunch of their claims are based on like regulation and accessibility, right? This might happen. Yeah, but it also might not. I do believe that as we saw, like regulation in tech sector is something that is incredibly hard. We also how incompetent senators are when they basically need to question Mark Zuckerberg, and basically Mark Zuckerberg then has to explain to them how the ad monetization on Facebook actually work, right? Also, as CG said, right, even if you regulate it, it will often come post the fact, meaning some of the harms of govs will actually occur, right? Finally, I do believe what they have as a positive impact is that it like leads to more closer understanding of preferences of people, and meaning parties have an incentive to basically be more particular, right? This is true, right? I'm not gonna lie. I do believe this is a very good impact. They explain it properly, right? But I don't think they explain the exclusivity of it, right? Because to some extent, it is, I think, intuitive to know that a bunch of parties already at the status quo have a huge incentive to basically be very particular, to target niche voters, right? To basically be single issue parties, right? All of this is happening already in the status quo, and I do not think that they do enough of a job to point out why this benefit is something which is exclusively happening when you are able to micro-target with this type of analytics. Okay, with all this being said, what then is our constructive case, right? The constructive case is going to be just one very simple thing. Banning this type of specific targeting principally harms our ability to meaningfully consent and opt in at the ballot box. What are we defending on this, right? So notice that on our side of the house, people both see the broad and not targeting messaging, and additionally, they see the targeted messaging, right? As notice that even in the world where basically like parties like specifically target, right? I still see billboards, I still see TV ads, I still see posters, right? I still see very broad messaging, but in addition to that, right? I see particular messaging targeted towards my group, right? Both govs assume that the only type of messaging which I now am seeing is a targeted one. This is nonsense, right? This two things work in parallel, right? To some extent, this is the only principle just way. Why? Because my level of information now, when it goes to the ballot box, is actually much higher because I know what the party that I'm voting for. I know what is their broad messaging, but I also know what is the particular messaging which will harm my group. For example, if I'm a student, right, on our side of the house, I know what is the broad stance of Democrats on econ, but I also know what are their broad policies based on student loans, right? Things which do affect me and things which they target me for, right? This is the only just way to actively opt in at the ballot box, right? Because first of all, I can actually meaningfully see what is the full set of like great policies that these party actually proposes, right? Second of all, I can see inconsistencies, right? I can see that, for example, parties may be not consistent with what their broad stance is and what their particular stance like targeted towards me is, meaning I actually have the ability and agency to say, no, I don't want to vote for you. Or for example, I have the ability to say, yes, I want to vote for you because I see that your broad messaging is something which is in line with what you target me specifically for, right? All of this means that my choice at the ballot box is far more meaningful one because I actually have far more information and far more ability to exercise the agency that I do experience at the ballot box, right? And this is something which is based on our democracy, right? If my consent is not meaningful because some information are lacking, this is something which is fundamentally unjust. I will take OG.
As usual, you completely strawman our case on preference creation. Our material on precluding the discussion of trade-offs, maximizing extreme preferences in the short term, and preventing new ideas from entering the mainstream are all reasons why.
Sorry, please prove why these harms are exclusive. Okay, why your agency at the ballot box is actively harm when I do not know what is the particular messaging for my group, right? Basically, what does happen is I will vote only at the broad stance of my party, right? This is harmful because very often I will vote for them without knowing what are the specific policies that they have which actively target me, right? For example, if I'm a woman, right, I might vote for like Republicans because I know their broad stance on econ is. But for example, if I'm also like a student, I do not know what their stance maybe on student loan is. It means that very often I vote against my interest, but I very often vote just poorly informed because I'm not clear what are the specific policies which do affect me, right? And I do believe to some extent I'm less able to decide which of these two considerations is more important for me, right? I am unable to decide whether the broad stance of the party or the specific like messaging to me is something which I should value more or less, right? I'm unable to exercise my choice profoundly, and I do believe that this fundamentally is the biggest impact in the debate because I do believe that a bunch of harms from Gov can maybe be mitigated. But I do not think that the principal harm to our agency at the ballot box is something which we can solve. I'm very proud to oppose.
Great. Government Whip, the floor is yours.
Hi, just checking if I'm audible and visible.
Yeah, you're both of those things.
Sajid Priyastagura Bhujapur. Sorry, just give me a second. I'll just arrange my notes. Three, two, one. First, I'll start with addressing the rebuttals coming in from closing opposition, then their case, then opening opposition, then opening government. So first, in terms of addressing the rebuttals to our case from the closing opposition. So closing opposition basically didn't listen to a lot of Sajid's speech. And the reasoning I say behind this is what they say is a very lazy response of, but Facebook and Twitter echo chambers already exist. But what you need to understand in this particular instances, the existence of Facebook echo chambers does not necessarily mean that A, they cannot get worse, or B, that this particular policy amplifies the existence of them more across the board. What do I essentially mean by this? In the current world, yes, to a certain extent, you still have, without data analytics, the ability and the incentive to create some form of echo chambers to a certain extent. However, why is this far worse when you have advanced data analytics? Because in case of advanced data analytics, you have literally the mathematical and the rigorous backing to do so. What do I essentially mean by this? If you as a politician know for a fact that anti-Hispanic messages are something that is likely to feed into these people, because you know exactly what 70% of those people in that particular locality are searching for and have exact data on how they're doing it and in which articles they're doing it. You know, one, how to exactly shape the message, but two, you also know for a fact that you can get away with doing this because 70% of the people are doing this and you need to cater to them. Under our world, even if there is at least a 10% possibility that these individuals have, these territories have some Hispanic populations and so on and so forth, you are more likely to hedge your bets against this. What do I mean by this? In those circumstances, you're likely to create a social media message that is acceptable for more people because you don't know what is the percentage of like racist or anti-immigrant individuals and so on and so forth. But more importantly, if you want to create the second response to this is, if you want to create an anti-immigration narrative to begin with, you know exactly how to construct this based on their other preferences that they have. So for example, if there's a particular form of pop culture or literature that they prefer, then you can use that against them literally through advanced analytics to create those narratives, which you don't have the ability to do under our side if this technology in and of itself is particularly done. Thirdly, even if it is something that already exists to a certain extent, given that Sajid's and analytical reasons as to how this gets far worse and the ability for politicians to exploit that through their incentives is far worse, that should be enough for us to win the debate, which means that hate speech gets turned into riots and so on and so forth, which becomes much worse overall. Now, direct engagement to what CEO brings in, because what CEO brings in is quite interesting, but I'm not sure the value of this within this debate. And the reason I say this is, what they're essentially saying is that you need to meaningfully consent when you're going into democratic preference, which is voting and so on and so forth. And for that, these political parties need advanced analytics to do that. Number one, I'm not sure why you need advanced analytics to do that, particularly because there are still old school fashion ways, such as like, going door to door, knocking door to door, knowing people's preferences and so on and so forth. But secondly, this policy actually creates an incentive to ignore large parts of your policy preferences and consent. What do I mean by this? If you as an individual, most individuals in the world are complex and have multiple preferences and multiple ways of expressing their political views, this policy specifically targets and finds out what policy to a certain extent is likely to not is your first preference, by the way, is likely to get you more engaged. So maybe you're a moderate with some forms of insecurity as to, oh, you're not getting a job and so on and so forth. Maybe you can be fed into an anti-immigration bias in that particular instance. This policy allows you to do that, and therefore create a world in which you are made to ignore the rest of the policies that political parties have and so on and so forth, because you're able to create those silos and echo chambers within social media that do not allow you to meaningfully opt out of the particular preference that you have been fed into, because it is done in such an advanced analytical way that it essentially captures all of your preference, or the most likely of your preferences in those particular instances. What this means is the comparative is very simple. Under our world, you're likely to preference more people and see what is acceptable for more people generally, because you have no way of specifically targeting specific parts of the country through social, like absolute targeted ads and so on and so forth. You're more likely to listen to more people and therefore get more meaningful content, meaningful consent from them in terms of passing policies and so on and so forth, which means that in general, you're more likely to be able to get their preferences out better. But more importantly, if you really want to meaningfully consent to the things that politicians do and so on and so forth, I'm pretty sure we can make things such as, go through their whole policy paper and look through what policy preferences that they have. If a political party wants to do certain things, what is their policy position on student loans and so on and so forth. I'm not sure why you need advanced analytics in order to ensure that. So before I move on to opening opposition, I'll take a POI from them.
Look, this is comparatively more accessible because you don't have to hire 200 people to do it. So as we proved, you have the ability to target audiences you wouldn't otherwise be able to, maximize their choice and improve the political sphere even a bit by allowing them to get higher percentages and get into the sphere.
But this is contingent on A, that this higher, this specific targeting of these specific people is essentially something that is beneficial, but B, or at the same time, that you essentially listen to all of these individuals because that's somehow possible within the political arena. Because realize what the incentive of these people are. The incentive of these people is to win an election, which can be 50.1% of the vote in certain countries, maybe even 48% if you're counting United States of America and places like India that do not have popular voting and so on and so forth. You literally want to maximize the ability for these individuals to push them to vote, and then to vote for you in that particular instance. Why do you have an incentive to go out and cater to more populations, given the fact that you can literally win an election by specifically targeting 50.1% of the people? That's literally what Cambridge Analytica and Donald Trump already did in this particular circumstances, and they have no engagement to that at all because Donald Trump literally has no incentive to reach out to these politicians and so on and so forth. Moving on to opening opposition, in terms of their smaller parties and grassroots campaigns and so on and so forth, we think that social media campaigning is still possible to the extent to which grassroots campaigns should be more about going door to door, asking individuals for their preferences and rallying them to actually getting out their emotions in real life. We would prefer that happening the same way, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez happened and so on and so forth. But secondly, a lot of what they said is, but now this allows Democrats to target swing voters that have been already captured by Republicans. That's not necessarily true in this particular instance. Why? Because if someone has been already targeted and captured by Republican parties through advanced analytics, they have a far bigger advantage in already feeding them stuff within their algorithms, according to all of the structural analysis given by Sajid, to capture them for a permanent period or for a longer period of time. What this allows you is create that chamber that is harder to break. In our world, you do not have the ability to capture them in a way in which you do under their world, which means that it's easier to break these chambers and then break into and convince swing voters to vote otherwise and so on and so forth, because you do not have the ability to do this through things like Cambridge Analytica and so on and so forth. Lastly, we've given you structured responses as to why regulations is not possible in this particular instance. This is quite important because if regulation is not possible in this particular instance, and even if there is a 1% chance of all our harms existing, I'm pretty sure there's a far higher chance of what our harms existing, then we win this debate because that harm is far greater than any benefit that the op bench can bring you in this particular instance. Incredibly proud to propose.
Great. Opposition whip, the floor is yours.
Give me just to pull up my timer. I assume I'm still audible based on Marta's. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel is going to be a very classical whip speech. First, I'm going to deal with closing opposition. Then I'm going to weigh against opening government. Finally, I'm going to weigh against opening opposition. Let's first deal with the responses we hear from Sir David to Marta's speech. We hear, maybe echo chambers already exist, but they will get worse because reasons. We still don't have heard an actual mechanism for why they get worse. We still haven't heard how much worse it gets. We still haven't heard why the incentives are greater. Because notice they say, when I know that anti-Hispanic messages get me ahead, then I will use anti-Hispanic messages and anti-immigration. Panel, I will direct your attention to, the Republican policy of the 50s to early 2000s, where that was exactly their policy because they were already aware that their electorate didn't like Hispanics coming over the border, right? We know this, that Modi's BJP hasn't liked Muslims long before political targeting has occurred. When a party knows populist messaging works, they're going to use populist messaging, regardless of whether they can micro-target people or can choose not to micro-target people. I'm still at the end of closing government's arguments, unsure to what extent it gets worse. Secondly, they tell us that, but the meaningful, on our meaningful consent argument, they say, why do we need advanced analytics to do this? Because, and here's where Marta's analysis actually gets just flat out ignored from closing government, people are less likely to know, because Marta explains to you that on both sides of the debate, we have both the broad targeting and the micro-targeting, because you still put up posters, you still are going to be on television, you're still going to be on radio, you still have political debates between the candidates, so the broad messaging still exists. On top of that, however, what micro-targeting allows you to do is to inform voters of issues that may particularly pervade to them. That means when when an issue particularly is important to me, I can be informed that this is also part of the platform, even if the party strategy says this may not be the most important thing to target your broad analytics on. This means that on our side of the house, voters are significantly more likely to be informed of what benefits them specifically. Finally, we get this idea that more extreme parties can target the evil extremists on their side of the house more. Maybe, presumably, the nice parties can also target progressives more. I'm not sure to the extent to which this doesn't just cancel each other out. Presumably, most of those people are going to vote for those types of parties, regardless of which side of the debate we're on, so I'm unclear why I care all that much. Let's not deal with it. Actually, before I go on to opening government, let me take a POI from closing, because Marta took opening. Yeah, BRAC?
Right. It doesn't explain why your best case example of why our case doesn't make sense is the status quo. But the point is, when you ban it, of course it improves from the status quo because this data exists.
Yeah, I just don't understand why. You're not explaining to me why the existence of this data itself means that people target this significantly more. I'm unclear after two of your speeches how much it gets worse, to what extent it gets worse. Maybe it gets a little worse, but even if it gets a little worse, I think it is worth trading off against the ability to have a more informed electorate when the comparative is, that now voters actually know what they're getting themselves into and they know who actually represents their interests. Because ultimately, unlike what opening government tells us, no, OG, thank you. Unlike what opening government tells us, the comparative here is where can people actually maximize their preference? Because there's kind of this implicit idea in opening government that people should maximize the utility of their vote for the maximum of society. But that's not usually how we do these things, right? We don't have voter tests to make sure that you're a perfect utility calculator, right? Usually we allow people to vote on whatever fucking basis they want, meaning that we already to some extent agree that voters should be allowed to, make whatever decision. Now, opening government tells us that we're strawmanning their case. A couple of things here, like we always do. A couple of things here. First of all, I'm very curious to hear about the multiversal debates we've had against them, because we have never in our life faced Chicago. Two, more explicitly, like OG says, we basically require information and discourse in order to allocate our votes. Few things here. One, no one has all information, right? We don't require perfect information in any case in order to make votes in the first place, right? Non-targeted advertising usually doesn't drop an entire policy set on every single voter, making them perfectly informed individuals, right? Information overload makes it likely that you don't retain all the details of the policy anyways. Most voters don't go out and read every single policy proposal from every single party, right? Most voters don't bother to inform themselves to the maximum degree, meaning that opening government just asserts that there's significantly better discourse around this because for some reason we have broader discussion. It is unclear to us why that happens. Secondly, not every piece of information is of equal importance to every single voter. Oh, gee, we already took you in the member speech. Not every piece of information is equally important to every single voter, right? I have the right to remain ignorant in my election choices if it benefits me. I could be Jewish or Muslim or Hindu and prioritize significantly that a party cares about keeping me safe against other individuals. I could be queer and prioritize a party that wants to ensure that I can get married, that this is the type of policy that protects me. I could be a student and only care about, and only care about the party that reduces the amount of student debt I have left. I am allowed to be a single issue party and decide where I am more likely to be informed of how a party stands on the issue I care about the most is the site where I am better able to maximize the choice that benefit me and maximize my agency at the ballot box. This is the comparative then that is important to compared to opening government, because opening government says I should be more broadly informed. I should be more broadly informed about, how I make my elections decisions. They don't really explain why I have that moral duty towards other electors. I think more explicitly, parties should, voters ought to generally prioritize what benefits them personally, because that is the point of democracy. It is about maximizing the allocation of resources to society as it sees fit. Secondly, weighing to closing government, that they say that other policies or other policy things are also important. People can see all the information. Couple of things here. First of all, it makes it less likely for people to see it, because people generally don't go out and vote and read every single pamphlet and get all this information. On our side of the house, rather than people needing to go out and discover the information is brought to them from the parties themselves. It is the parties that push the information towards voters that actually care about them, meaning that the microtargeting will only impact the voters where a party actually has incentives to inform this information, right? The harm is that if you don't understand where your priorities, where your preferences are maximized, that is where you're less able to decide what is best for you, right? Given that you're therefore not maximally informed on either side of the debate, we think it is better for voters to be informed on the specific issues that they themselves are most informed about. That is the comparative. Finally, weighing us against OO, because I do think that OO is correct on a lot of the things they tell us. They're correct, about how about small parties and all that stuff. But we think that regardless of whether or not this really benefits small parties, or if government side is right and people with large money can use the system more, we think on either side of the debate, for sure it is guaranteed. On our side of the debate, what is for sure guaranteed is that principally every single voter is most likely to better be informed about what every single party does for them. It is this piece of information that makes it particularly critical in order for people to make the kinds of choices that are morally relevant at the ballot box. Super proud to stand in opposition.
Great. I thank that speaker for an excellent speech, and indeed everyone for what was an excellent quarterfinal. We're going to adjudicate now. I assume what happens is that everybody else leaves this room, and we'll deliberate and get back to you when we have a call.
Thanks for the debate, guys.